Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 12 of AMSCO, which is the first chapter in the last period of the semester. So this is the end of period 5. Actually, we'll finish up with reconstruction after the semester ends, but let's get going. This is 1830 to 1860, and it has to do with territorial and economic expansion as the United States spans from sea to shining sea. So they expand the territory all the way from the East Coast to the Pacific Ocean through negotiations, through wars, through treaties, all sorts of things, and just squatting, living there. Okay, so just to remind you what's going on at this time, everything that we have talked about so far, things are very rapidly changing in America at this time after the War of 1812. There's a lot going on. There's that Second Great Awakening, so that brings this period of social reform. So all of this is coinciding at the same time that people are moving west. There's the Industrial Revolution, so you have people living in basically huts out on the prairie while others are living in these big tenement brick buildings on the East Coast. It just seems very diametrically opposed, very different at the same time. We get a second party system with the emergence of the Whig Party. You're also going to see that there's going to be the emergence of the Republican Party, and they win their first presidential election at the end of this period in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln. That's also the beginning of the Civil War. There's also an increase in federal power rather than at the state level. This was aided significantly by the tenure of John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There's this great feeling of nationalism, and people want to spread America across the ocean or across the land to the Pacific Ocean. And so what this does is this helps to stimulate all of these things. It helps to stimulate Western expansion. So this idea, and you may remember this from middle school when you took history, was manifest destiny. This term of manifest destiny was first used by a newspaper editor, John O'Sullivan, in 1845. And what he said, and I'm going to read this to you, it's the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence, he means God, has given to us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federative development of self-government entrusted to us. It is right, such as that of the tree to the space of air and the earth, suitable for the full expansion of its principle and destiny of growth. So what he was saying, that God has basically ordained for Americans through their system of democracy to spread from the East Coast to the West Coast and wherever, because others are looking to go other places, because we have this new system. And this idea of liberty was revolutionary. It was new to humans worldwide. And so he's saying it's right that we do this. It's right that we spread from sea to shining sea and spread this idea of liberty to everybody. So what happens with talking about this and people moving west is sort of this romantic notion about what the West is like, and it's all adventure. And so people kind of have one view of the West, but in reality, another view, very different view exists for those who actually go out there. So this term manifest destiny spreads throughout the United States, and it's used and it goes hand in hand with this feeling of nationalism at the same time, and this idea that they have to civilize the Native Americans and the Mexicans and everybody else for that matter. A lot of Northerners are opposed to this because there's growing abolitionism in the North too, and they're fearful about the spread of slavery. So there's just all sorts of things going on at one time. All right, this picture we're going to talk about later too. It was a painting done by John Gast in 1872. It looks like it would be huge, but really it's a small painting, maybe 15, 16 inches by 12 inches, so it's not really that big. The painter did it because he was commissioned to do so by this man who, I don't know, a travel brochure for the West. And so what it does, there's all sorts of symbolism in it, and you can look at, you might think, wow, who's that big woman in the middle? It's a symbol. She is supposed to represent liberty, Lady Liberty, the United States. And on her, there's a star of federalism. She's carrying a book, and that's supposed to mean education. In her other hand, she has a telegraph wire. And so she's going from the east to the west. And you can see behind her, it's kind of light, but she's going into darkness and clouds. And you can see behind her, there's the development of civilization, some cities, probably canals, the railroad's behind her. But kind of in her wake, there are people moving westward. You have the Conestoga wagon, probably this guy just on a horse. You got the buffalo, and look at the Native Americans. They're like, what is going on? Kind of fearful. So there's a lot of symbolism in this, and it represents that notion of manifest destiny. Another thing, your book didn't mention this, but kind of a romantic version of the West, people always talk about the Pony Express. This was not something that occurred for a long time. As a matter of fact, it only occurred for less than a year, or maybe just slightly over a year, right? April of 1860 to November of 1861. Guys who would ride on these horses out west and deliver the mail. They'd go from St. Louis to San Francisco. It only took 10 days. They'd ride a certain amount of the place, or a certain amount of the journey, and then somebody else would do another leg. This was replaced, though, when they got the Transcontinental Railroad, so they weren't as needed. You see this help wanted thing. It's the young, skinny, wiry fellows, preferred orphans, right? Not sure. All right, so this is what we're talking about with the West at this time in the 1820s and 1830s. The states that were in the Union at this time are the ones in white. The only thing that was officially the United States was the unorganized territory that was part of the Louisiana Purchase. The other part that's in the greenish blue color, that belonged to Mexico when Mexico gets its independence in 1823. Then the peak part, through treaty with England, we had joint occupation there until 1818. Also, there were some disputes about the boundary, the border between the United States and Canada. And so what's going to happen is all of this is going to be filled in, and we are going to get what is now the contiguous United States, excluding Canada, or I'm sorry, excluding, not yet, right? Excluding Alaska and Hawaii. That was a joke. We're not going to invade Canada again. Okay, so let's talk about Texas first. This is the way the book does it. So Mexico, when they got their independence, they wanted people to settle in the northern part of their country because they were fearful about Native American attacks. There's the Arapaho, there's the Apache, the Comanche, all sorts of different Native American tribes who were fighting against the Mexican government. So this one guy, Moses Austin, gets a huge land grant to make settlements in Texas. He dies, but then his son, Stephen Austin, right here in the picture, and you guessed it, this is what Austin, Texas is named after. This person right there, he's the son of Moses Austin, and he leads about 300 families into Texas. And what they do is they go down there and they start farming. Some of them, you know, they farm cotton and they have slaves. And pretty soon there are more Americans there than there are Mexicans in what is now Texas, by a ratio of 3 to 1. Mexico has laws that says you're required to be Catholic if you're going to be there. And so you have to convert, and they outlawed slavery. Well, you know, Americans, if they don't like the law, they just don't abide by it. So they didn't abide by it, right? So there's conflict. And then there's this guy. His name is Santa Anna. His whole name is General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. But anyway, we're just going to call him Santa Anna. So he periodically is the leader of Mexico. He kind of comes and goes. He's a military dictator. He's a leader. And while he's a leader, he starts to enforce these rules upon the people of Texas, and he closes the border. Well, this kind of makes the people mad, but people flood in anyway. They just kind of keep coming. Again, Americans, if they don't like a law or rule, they just ignore it and they do what they want. So they keep coming in, but then Santa Anna is enforcing it, and the settlers are upset about this. So under the leadership of a man by the name of Sam Houston, you guessed it, Houston, Texas, they revolt and they declare their independence, and they declare the Republic of Texas in March of 1836. So Santa Anna and his army attack these people who have declared their independence, first at this one fortress called the Alamo in San Antonio, and this was February through March of 1836. You've probably heard about this. So they surround this fortress. The Americans are inside, and I think that the number is closer to about 185 rather than 200 to 220. But they lay siege to it. So the Mexicans surround it for about 13 days. All of the Americans inside die, including Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. Now, these are these great historic, sort of heroic settler frontiersmen in American history. Then they go on, the Mexican army does, and they massacre 342 Americans at Goliad. These people had surrendered and they were prisoners of war. And as they surrendered, they had the white flag and everything. The Mexicans just come and kill them. And so people are just furious about these two instances that take place. So this and the Alamo in Texas is sacred to the people of Texas. Just remember that. I remember I moved to Texas in 1982. Ozzy Osbourne was on tour down there, and he went to the Alamo, and there's this big sort of commemorative monument to the Alamo that was built during the Great Depression, and he urinated on it. And he's been banned from the Alamo ever since because nobody goes there and does that to the Alamo because it's sacred. All right, so what we have is now the Lone Star Republic that's going to be declared, right? So they have this, they have their own flag and everything else. So what happens is the Americans end up winning. They go down and they're able to kind of surround the Mexican army at San Jacinto, which is Houston, Texas now. Santa Anna's defeated and under threat. They say either, come to this treaty with us or we're going to kill you. And so he does. And so what it says is that Texas is an independent country, and the Americans assume that it goes to the Rio Grande River, but the Mexicans under Santa Anna see that it goes to the Nueces River, right? So this treaty is signed up, or it's drawn up, and then it's sent to the Mexican legislature, and they're like, no, we're not going to give up this territory to these people. They didn't recognize it, but the Texans did because Santa Anna signed off on it. All right, so this is where they believed that their territory was. So let's look at what happens here. This right here is the Alamo, and then this is Goliad right here, right? This is where people were murdered after they had surrendered. And you see all these orange stars. Those are battles that the Americans lost. Those were Mexican victories. Then we get a couple of good victories, or Americans get some victories under Houston. Houston defeats the Mexican army here, and then he follows them up here to what is today present-day Houston, San Jacinto, and this is where they surround Santa Anna and they sue. They lay siege to him and say, agree to peace or else, and so he does. And now we have the independent Texas Republic. However, I want to draw one more thing to your attention. This right here is the Rio Grande River. This is the current border between the United States and Mexico. This right here, though, up here, this is the Nueces River, right? But then this is what they believe at this border right here. This is what the people of Mexico believe is the boundary. So that is in dispute. I went through all of this because this is going to be something that leads to the war between the United States and Mexico, not Texas, the Lone Star Republic. It's an independent country at this point. Okay, so anyway, this is the territory that is Texas, and it only lasted from 1821 to 1836. So I just had the flag up there, the Lone Star. Did you see what they did? They had red, they had white, and one star. Not like every time we get a new state in the United States, we have a star to the flag. They had just one star. So they're the Lone Star Republic. And remember how they did it. They just kind of go in there and settle there. Their numbers get high, and then they declare themselves independent. California is going to try to do the same thing. All right, if you look over here, Texas also had their own Declaration of Independence. So they're kind of repeating what the United States did with England. All right, so what they want to do, Sam Houston and others, they want to be annexed to the United States. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe there was strength in numbers. Maybe they saw themselves as Americans, so nationalist sort of sentiment. But under the presidency of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, they just kind of shied away from it because this was a very controversial issue because of the issue of slavery. Eventually, what's going to happen, John Tyler is going to just annex it through a simple joint resolution of Congress. Tyler does try to present a treaty to the Senate to annex it, but it was denied. So he tries that, but then he tries another method after Polk had been elected president, and he's a lame duck president. Then he does it through a joint resolution of Congress. All right, so let's get to Tyler, the way Tyler becomes president. If you recall, William Henry Harrison, he was running for president in 1840 against Martin Van Buren, and that was the log cabin and hard cider campaign, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So he's elected. When he's elected, Henry Clay is kind of like the leader of the new Whig Party. Daniel Webster is the Secretary of State. And so they come into office, and as you know, William Henry Harrison gives this very long inaugural address. It's cold outside. He's older. Um, he's exposed to the elements for a long time, and he stays up too long. But many historians believe that he caught pneumonia and then he dies. And then this guy John Tyler becomes the next president. Now Tyler is kind of a Whig in name only. He comes in, and the Whigs think that they're just going to control him, especially Henry Clay. He just thinks we're just going to make Tyler do whatever we want him to do. But he had, Tyler, different ideas. So as you know, the Whigs want the bank, they want protective tariffs, and they want internal improvements. Tyler ends up being more like Andrew Jackson than he does Henry Clay, even though he's a Whig, right? And he's also more of a states writer. So anyway, we have all these issues that come up that look very similar to what came up during Jackson's administration. There's the issue of the bank, right? Clay attempts to establish a new bank, and Tyler vetoes it. And here now the Whigs are in power. They're thinking they no longer have Jackson. They no longer have Martin Van Buren. They can go and they can implement the American system, right? And so the Whigs are really upset. They're so upset that they call Tyler his excellency instead of his excellency, and they just expel him from the party, right? And so they're like, you can't be in here. And then a lot of people move to impeach him. A lot of Whigs do, except for Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster is the Secretary of State. He is part of that great triumvirate between Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, these three greats in Congress at this time. There's also a protective tariff, and he vetoes that too initially. Eventually, he agrees to one that's a little bit more moderate. So he's at war with his own party. All right, speaking of wars, there's also this little war between lumberjacks up in our northern border, up in Maine, right? So there's these people up there are kind of fighting over who has what territory to log, right? To go and extract lumber from the woods up there. So this is the only war that's ever been declared by a state, because you can't count Texas because they weren't part of the country at that time. So anyway, it has to do with the border between New Brunswick and Maine up in our northern border. And again, it's because the Americans have expelled these Canadian lumberjacks. They're like, hey, we had this territory. We're here first. So it's a big threat, right? And so Congress calls up 50,000 men. They appropriate $10 million to pay for this war. Everybody's still mad at England anyway, right? We fought 2 wars with them. Let's fight another one. General Winfield Scott, though, he goes and he negotiates sort of this truce at the border, but they don't have a treaty yet, and tensions are kind of high. Then there's another incident. This is very similar to the Amistad incident, except this was an American ship, the Creole, and it was transporting slaves from one part of the United States to another part. So it's going from Virginia around Florida to New Orleans, right? So they're there. The slaves revolt, but they force the ship to go to the Bahamas, which is a British colony. England says they're free because we don't have slavery here anymore, right? Americans are mad. Well, Americans in the South are mad, right? Those are fighting words. And so Daniel Webster was able to negotiate an agreement with them, rather than go to war. It also, though, exacerbates tension between the North and the South here in the United States, less than 20 years from the Civil War. Okay, so here in 1842, this is the settlement that Daniel Webster comes to. What they did is they divided that territory that was in dispute between Canada and the United States, between Maine and New Brunswick, the province of New Brunswick. So they're going to settle that. And then not only that, they're going to settle some territory that's up in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, known as the Wasabi Range. And so this was negotiated by Daniel Webster, who is our Secretary of State at the time, and then Lord Alexander Ashburton. It took several months to negotiate while they were there in Washington, D.C. But what it did is it split the territory, and this ended up being very, very beneficial to the United States because in the Wasabi Range there, it's very iron rich or iron ore rich, and this was going to be very important for the Industrial Revolution and the production of steel. Okay, so there's another boundary dispute too that was settled. Now remember from the 1818 agreement, the United States and England agreed to share Oregon, right? And then through the Adams-Onis Treaty, we had settled our border with Mexico. But as you know, that changed when Texas went in there and became an independent country. Okay, so Americans have a lot of claims to this Oregon territory. England has less than 1,000 people there. Very few people were coming and trading or living. There were some British people. It was hard to get to if you were English, right? You have to go through America to get to Oregon, or you have to sail around the world, halfway around the world to get to Oregon. And very few ships at this time could actually get there. It was very difficult to do. And if you look at maps from this period, the coast of Oregon isn't even charted because for the most part, they didn't know what was there. So we had a lot of people who had moved there. Americans had gone there. Captain Robert Gray, he came in, he discovered the Columbia River. That's the river that separates Oregon from Washington, current Oregon and Washington. Also, of course, the Lewis and Clark expedition that went and explored there. John Jacob Astor, who became a very wealthy fur trader, he went there and he extracted furs with his company, and they established Astoria in Oregon. And then there were some missionaries who went there and they tried to Christianize Native Americans. So by 1846, there were over 5,000 Americans living in Oregon, greatly outnumbered the British who were there. So this is another thing that your book doesn't talk about is the Whitman mission. This was a mission in Walla Walla, Washington, which is just across the border in present day Oregon and Washington. So it's actually in Washington across the Umatilla River, so near Umatilla, Pendleton, and those places in Oregon. This is right where I grew up as a kid. So they went there and they established this mission. And they tried to convert Native Americans, as I told you. They had the Nez Perce there, but also the Cayuga Indians. And what happened is there was an outbreak of measles that kind of swept through the Indian population. And so the Native Americans blamed these people. And so what they do is they kill them. And so a lot of people are very upset by what happened to these missionaries. And so they want to send more forces out there to protect settlers in the Oregon country. And the Oregon country at this time did include Oregon and Washington, and actually parts of Canada. Okay, so what we're going to see from 1840 to 1860 is this massive migration of people. And I say massive, it was about 250,000 people that flock to the west. And you can see these two huge spikes. And this occurred about the same time as the gold rush, right? Especially California. That's what the spikes are doing. It was the same time as the gold rush, and that's what encouraged people to go. At this time, too, a lot of people want to annex Texas. They want to take possession of Oregon. And so a lot of people, too, are going to California to play the Texas game, right? They think, well, if we can just populate this region, declare our independence, and then we can become our own country, right? So a lot of people want to do the same thing. And as a matter of fact, they create the Bear Flag Republic. It was very short-lived, though. All right, then we get the election of 1844. So this is an interesting election. The Democrats were split. You had the Northern Democrats and then the Southern Democrats. Northern Democrats, we had Martin Van Buren. He was president, and then he lost to Harrison. Tyler's not running for re-election. Doesn't stand a chance. He doesn't even get the nomination from the Whigs, right? So Martin Van Buren comes, and then all of a sudden now he's kind of an abolitionist. And then you get John C. Calhoun, who's a strong supporter of slavery in the South. So because they're split, the Democrats can't seem to find a candidate. So they have a new convention, and this dark horse candidate, somebody that nobody really knows about, kind of comes from nowhere, and that's what the term dark horse is. So he's a horse in the race, right? And he came from nowhere. Was James K. Polk. He's from Tennessee. And he just put it out there on the line. He's like, we're going to annex Texas. We're going to take over Oregon, and we're going to take it all the way up to the 5440 line, or we're going to fight, right? And we're also going to get California. So he's like, we're just going to take it all this land. Henry Clay was chosen by the Whigs, but he kind of flip-flopped on the issue of annexation. First he was for it, and then he was opposed to it. And then we have James Birney of the Liberty Party, and he gets support from those people who are opposed to annexation of Texas, and then also those opposed to slavery. Okay, so this is how the election played out. James K. Polk, he wins the Electoral College by 62%. He only gets 50% of the popular vote. What I want you to notice here, though, Clay, he's in it. He gets 48. Poor Clay, he never became president. But Birney of the Liberty Party gets 2% of the vote. This is kind of a sign of things to come. So John C. Calhoun, which I already showed you. So that's all known. Okay, now there's going to be a song coming up. I'm not sure if you're going to hear it or not, so we'll see. So I'm pretty sure it wasn't going to work to play that song, so, and I don't know how this is going to work to go from, I skipped 4 slides. So it might have been weird for you guys to see that. Anyway, so Polk becomes president, and he's only 1 term. And he comes in and he says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to annex Texas. We're going to reduce the tariff. We're going to get an independent treasury. We're going to acquire California and Oregon. And that's what he does. And he's like, did everything I came to do. I'm not going to run for president again. And he didn't. He was just 1 term. So anyway, the annexation of Texas, he didn't really have to do, because from the time that Polk was elected to the time they took office, Tyler's like, well, American people must want this, so let's go ahead and make it happen. So with a simple joint resolution through Congress, they kind of signed off on it, and then Texas became part of the United States. As far as the tariff goes, he vetoed the initial attempt to increase the tariff, and then he agrees to a moderate tariff of just 25%. So this is very similar to what Tyler had done. He also gets an independent treasury. This is kind of like a bank. but it's independent of, it's more by the government. It's not by these elite businessmen, the elites that run it, or foreigners or anything like that. And then we do get the acquisition of California and Oregon, but California is going to come as a result of the war with Mexico. Okay, so as far as Oregon goes, so if you look at this line up there just north of Fort Simpson, that's the 5440 parallel. And Polk's campaign slogan was 5440 or fight, right? People had Oregon fever. It's like, we're going to take the whole thing. But then what they decide to do is they negotiate to maintain the line that had been established by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty to keep our northern boundary with Canada at the 49th parallel. So we do that so that we don't have the tension with England, because remember, they had all of Canada. The only little snag in all of that was Vancouver Island and Victoria. I always wish that we had gotten that territory because it's beautiful up there. So the major event, the biggest event that occurred during Polk's administration was the Mexican-American War. This lasted from 1848 until 46 to 48. So what we need to know about this war is what caused it, how is it that we went to war with Mexico, and what were the effects. Many historians see the War of 1812 as a turning point in U.S. history, because at this point there's all this new land that's going to become available for the expansion of slavery, and this creates conflict and debate in government and among the American people about the issue of slavery. So that is why it's considered to be a turning point. All right, so Polk he desires California and all of this territory. So he sends this guy, John Slidell, to Mexico to negotiate an agreement where we establish the border between Texas and the United States at the Rio Grande River. He wanted to propose that any claims that Americans had against the Mexican government for damages or anything like that would be assumed by the United States government. The government would pay Mexico $5 million for California and New Mexico. And by saying New Mexico, that meant Arizona and New Mexico. So Arizona, New Mexico, and California for $5 million. Mexico wouldn't even allow Slidell to meet with them. They refused to do that, and they insisted that their northern border was at the Nueces River. So the Americans get mad about this, especially Polk. So the incident that set off the Mexican-American War was when Polk sends General Zachary Taylor down to the border with Mexico. Now remember, Mexico says that the Nueces River is the northern border. Right? So what Zachary Taylor does is he marches from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande River. Initially, no battle ensues, but then Polk, because he was so insulted by the Slidell mission being refused even the chance to present some sort of terms, he was going to ask for war anyway, and might have even gotten it. Who knows? But what was reported to have happened, they said that these Mexican military, they crossed over into American soil, they crossed the Rio Grande, and then fighting broke out. The Mexican army fired on U.S. soldiers. 11 Americans were killed. So Taylor defeats the Mexicans, though, at this battle, but this starts the war. Right? This gives Polk the ammunition he needs to go to Congress and say, we want war, American blood was shed on American soil. But the question was it American soil? It was in that area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande River, which Mexico claimed was their land. Okay, so Polk goes to Congress and he says, Mexico passed the boundary of the United States. They've invaded our territory and they shed American blood upon American soil. So it only took a couple of days and Congress declares war. Mexico never officially declared war on the United States. What they had to do is defend themselves when America goes and attacks them. So some people were questioning all of this. There's a group of people that issued these resolutions, right? And one of them was this young upstart Whig congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln says, the administration, we would like to identify what spot was American blood shed, right? So they really weren't into this war. They didn't think that there was legitimate reasons to go to war. It's like, where exactly did this happen? Because everybody knew that this was a space or a location that was in conflict. So anyway, the war, if we look at it, how it was fought, we had this guy, Stephen Kearny. He goes in with forces and he takes over New Mexico and California territory. And then you have John Fremont. He took control of Northern California and he proclaimed that the Bear Flag Republic, very similar to the Lone Star Republic. And the thing that they did, they had this flag with a bear on it. I don't know if you guys remember Hollister or if it's even still around. If you go into Hollister, there's always the California flag, or if you see the California flag, it has a bear on it. But that's the Bear Flag Republic, right? So then we get General Zachary Taylor. They call him Old Rough and Ready. He leads a force of 6,000 from the north across the Rio Grande River to Buena Vista in February of 1847. Then General Winfield Scott, he comes in from the Gulf of Mexico. He lands at Veracruz, and then he goes and he takes Mexico City, and he forces the government to surrender and to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So they're coming in, they're taking California from the north, and then California and New Mexico from the north and the east, and then we're coming down from Texas and then coming from the Gulf of Mexico. So it's almost like a four-prong attack from the north to Mexico. All right, so this map shows you where the major battles took place. And if you notice, there is only one Mexican victory, right? And that is right there in what would be today San Diego, Tijuana, right there at the border of what is now California and Mexico at the Baja. So if you look at Northern California right here, Fremont's forces came in from the north and also the northeast right there. And then Kearny's forces came from the east, moving along here, eventually moving this direction. There's also forces coming in from the Pacific along the coastal areas. And then Zachary Taylor is driving down this direction, and some other people as well. Your book doesn't mention them. But then General Winfield Scott comes in here at Veracruz, and then he pushes over into this location to Mexico City, where he requires their surrender. You can't see it, but the very bottom right here, I want you to notice this is a place called Cerro Gordo. So just keep that in mind. All right, so for the Mexican government, they didn't even declare war on us, and they're very politically divided and unprepared for war. They had only had their independence for like 20 years. Right, so and only about 75,000 Mexicans lived even north of the Rio Grande River, so Americans kind of dominated them anyway, and they weren't politically unified or organized to fight against the Americans. So Mexico was easily defeated by the bigger force from the United States. All right, so there's a couple of people that you need to be aware of. This is Zachary Taylor. He was referred to as Old Rough and Ready, right? This is him at Palo Alto, that conflict that occurred there that started the war. And then this right here is the Bear Flag Republic. So this is the flag that they had. It's kind of, this was the inspiration for the flag that California has now, right? So a lot of Americans are flooding in there. They're encouraged to do so by Captain John C. Fremont. I know where I grew up in Galesburg, I grew up a lot of places, but in Galesburg they had a Fremont Street, one of the busiest streets there. It's named after John C. Fremont, because he was very popular at the time that Galesburg was established. But anyway, these groups, they carried this flag with a bear on it, and then once they defeated the Mexican army there in California, they raised this flag, but it's going to be lowered very quickly once the U.S. flag is raised in July of 1846. So it's only up for about a few weeks. All right, so funny story. There's a group of Illinois militia who come across Santa Ana during the battle that is south of Mexico City called Cerro Gordo. And they come across Santa Ana, who had stopped to eat his lunch, a roasted chicken. Now, Santa Ana had a prosthetic leg. He had lost his leg during the French Pastry War. They gave it whole military burial and everything else, and he had this cork leg. So the Americans come across him, and he's eating his lunch at this time, and the Americans take his leg. They also find a chest of gold that was going to be used to pay the Mexican army, and they took that. They go back to their hometown of Griswold, Illinois, and they take this peg leg around to bars and things and let people see it for like a nickel or that sort of thing. They write on it, and you can see the writing is here and that sort of thing. And then they end up renaming their small town of Griswold Cerro Gordo after the location where they acquired this leg. And of course, we all know it. It's Cerro Gordo, Illinois, that is not far from here. If you would like to see Santa Ana's leg, I've seen it numerous times. It is in Springfield, Illinois, at the Military Museum there off MacArthur Boulevard. So anyway, just a funny note there. All right, so at the Battle of Veracruz, American military ships go in there. They lay siege to the beachhead. This is the first large-scale amphibious assault by the United States military with a force of 14,000. They just really overwhelmed the Mexican government. So they go from Veracruz. This is the same track that Cortez used to go from the coast there to Tenochtitlan to defeat the Aztecs, right? So it's kind of the same thing that old Fuss and Feathers did, and this is General Winfield Scott. And that's what they call him, Old Fuss and Feathers. So 6 months after Veracruz, he marches and takes the capital, and this was September 14th, 1847, and what they do is they force the Mexican government to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this is a copy of the treaty right there with Nicholas Trist, our representative. He signed it. So did representatives from Mexico and other locations. And what you need to know are all the different parts of the treaty. So Mexico gives up claims to Texas, and they recognize the border as the Rio Grande. Mexico gives the United States California and New Mexico, which includes New Mexico and Arizona. The United States gives Mexico $15 million, and they agreed to pay any claims against the Mexican government by U.S. citizens. So this guy right here is Nicholas Trist. He was our representative and negotiator at the treaty conference to come up with this. All right, but before the war had even started or anything had been resolved, there's a man by the name of David Wilmot who proposed the Wilmot Proviso. What Polk wanted was money to negotiate the end of the war. A lot of people who were fearing the end of it said, we need to do something to address the issue of slavery. So David Wilmot, who is from Pennsylvania, he attaches a rider. That's something that's kind of attached to a bill that really doesn't pertain to it, where we'll give you $2 million. However, you need to sign off on there not being any slavery in the lands acquired from Mexico, right? It doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Now, the provision passed the House, but in the Senate, where the South dominated, they had more people there or more people who were sensitive to the needs of the South, they didn't go along with it, right? But what happened, this drew more of a wedge between, or it created more of a wedge between the North and the South over the issue of slavery, because the South was infuriated by it, and so was the North that it didn't pass. And so this was just one more thing that exacerbates tensions between the North and the South, leading to the Civil War. And this is also going to help to bring about the creation of the Republican Party, who wins the presidential election of 1860, of course, with Abraham Lincoln. All right, so as a result of this war, it took 17 months at $100 million, and about 13,000 Americans died, not from the war itself, but rather from disease, illnesses, those sorts of things. New territories were brought into the Union, which of course forced this explosive issue of slavery that became front and center for the United States. And it brought in 1 million square miles of land, which included Texas, to the United States. The new territory would upset the balance of power between the North and the South, and it created two very popular new Whig candidates, or Whig generals, who would run for president, and that's General Winfield Scott and also Zachary Taylor. And what we see is manifest destiny is partially realized. All right, so this is the land from the Mexican cession, all that territory that's in the green. What's going to happen next is we're going to get the Gadsden Purchase as well. All right, so manifest destiny to the south, even further south. So some people wanted to go much further. They thought, especially Southerners, they're like, well, we want to take all of Mexico, go down the Baja, Honduras, Nicaragua, but they were really eyeing Cuba, right? So all these Southerners wanted to spread an agrarian society, plantation economy, and slavery to other parts of the Americas, North America. All right, especially Cuba. So a lot of Southerners were eyeing Cuba for a long time, and Polk even offered Spain $100 million. Now, Spain, they're holding on to the last bit of their empire, and they refuse, right? And so tensions mount between Spain and the United States, and some people are talking about seizing that. And then Franklin Pierce, even though he's from the North, he's very pro-Southerner. He's elected president, and he's kind of secretly scheming to do this. He sends some diplomats to Ostend, Belgium, to negotiate it, but word gets out, and people are furious about this, people in the North anyway. So Pierce backs down. He doesn't do it. Oh, maybe this is inappropriate, but you can look at the manifesto through this meme. I'll give you a minute. I'm not going to say anything. Okay. And then there's this guy. Now, if you're like me, you're thinking, really? This guy looks like he's 12. Right? But anyway, his name is William Walker, and he attempts to go down and seize Baja California from Mexico. Baja California is that peninsula that comes down from California. Then that failed. So he goes to Nicaragua, and he leads this rebellion. He wins. He declares himself president in 1855. He's got some recruits from the South that go and help him. They probably thought, you know, they're superior to others. I don't know what he thought. We'd have to read his diaries. But anyway, he attempts to create his own country with a plantation economy there. They get recognition from the United States as a country and as a government for a while, but it all collapsed because he was killed. People came, they capture him, and they execute him in 1860. All right, and then there's even other expansion, but this was by the federal government. So one thing that the United States had been looking at doing for a long time was creating a canal. You know, they're doing all this canal building up in the Northeast, and so they wanted to do a canal from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean, so a trans-ocean canal. It would connect, inter-ocean canal. It would connect the two. So the Brits and the French had tried and failed. They had worked together and done the Suez Canal, but they go there and they just get bogged down. They get into big debt from this. The French pull out. They just can't do it. The main reason they couldn't do it is the geography, the indigenous population, but also malaria. Because the place was infested with mosquitoes, and so it spread diseases. So the United States was eyeing this, and so was England. And so they did what they did, sort of like with the Oregon Territory, they agreed to share it. And this is with the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. It was our Secretary of State, John Clayton, and British Minister to the United States, Henry Bulwer. So what they said is that the United States, neither the United States or England would act to create a canal at that time. Later, though, because England's going to be embroiled in the Boer War and other things going on in other parts of the world, they agree to the Hay-Pansfoot Treaty, where they kind of can surrender the rights to do that, and then the United States is free to create a canal, and the canal would be built. They'd start building it in like 1901, 1902, and it would be ready just in time for the first ships to pass through for World War I. Okay, and then there's the Gadsden Purchase. Now, this was territory down in the South, and you might be thinking, well, wasn't Mexico or New Mexico and Arizona good enough? No. So what they wanted to do was build a transcontinental railroad, and um, Stephen Douglas wanted one in the north, right? He wanted a transcontinental railroad there, but Jefferson Davis wanted one from the south. And because of the terrain down in this region of Arizona, it would have been a better location to do a transcontinental railroad than going further north through the Rocky Mountains or the Great Plateau and areas there. So what the United States did, they, under Franklin Pierce, and with a lot of influence from Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, they went and bought that territory from Mexico for $10 million. The railroad was never built, though, because of the time frame in which this was done, at least not the railroad that they had intended at that time. But then we're going to get the Gadsden Purchase. Okay, so settlement elsewhere in Western Territory. And now that all of this land is free, people are going to go and they're going to start settling in that territory. And you can see this is all the new land that had opened up. You get Washington, Oregon, Idaho, all these different locations. They hadn't become states yet, though. But this is the territory. So the Mexican Cession is in blue, the Oregon country is in green, the Gadsden Purchase is in the dark blue, right? So all of this land is opened up. Most people were not settling on most of the land that was the Louisiana Purchase because they saw that as the Great American Desert. People didn't think that you could settle there. A little bit more on this. U.S. surveyor Stephen Long, he went in there and he surveyed the territory and he thought that it was unfit for cultivation. So people wouldn't be going there. It would require all sorts of work to cultivate. And so it was really uninhabitable. So a lot of people weren't going. So there were several groups of people who were going out west to kind of seek their fortune, get land. They had all different purposes for going. Some of these people were mountain men, fur traders. They were very independent, very hardy people. They go out there, they trade with the Native Americans, and this started early on in the 1820s. What they did is they hunted for fur. They lived off of the element, off of the environment. They met with Native Americans sometimes twice a year, but a lot of times annually at something called a rendezvous, where they trade for supplies, weapons, furs, and that sort of thing. Some of them were very well known. Probably one of the most well known was Jim Bridger here. Another guy was Jedediah Smith. There was a lot of legend about him. A movie was made about him. I think Robert Redford played Jedediah Smith. There's James Beckwith, Kit Carson, and others. A lot of them went out there, though, and what they did is they mapped out the terrain, and that's how others knew about the territory and how they could make treks out there, different trails to go west. They learned from these mountain men who they were the first to go. They forged the trail. So these people were they were going out there overland. You could go by sea, but that would have been very expensive. So in 1860, hundreds and thousands of people were going west. I think what did we say? Between 1840 and 1860, 250,000 people went. So they were taking these very specific trails, the Oregon Trail, California Trail, Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail. Usually they left from like Independence, Missouri, so they crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis right there, and that's why it's known as the gateway to the west, and that's why the arch was built. And if you go to the arch, you could go down at the base of it, and there's a museum down there, and it talks about all of this, all these people who blazed the trails going westward. People usually when they went, they only went about 15 miles a day. It was very difficult terrain, and they had to hurry. They would leave in early spring, and they were hurrying because they wanted to get there before winter. The final passage, if you were going to California, was through the Sierra Nevada mountains, which were very steep. A lot of people feared Native Americans, but that wasn't the thing that killed most people. Most of them died from diseases. And now my kids were of the age where one of the first computer games was the Oregon Trail. And you play this game, and it's kind of a game of luck. It was a computer game. Most everybody died from dysentery. Very few people actually made it to Oregon. Okay, so here you can see the trails. The one, the Oregon Trail, kind of follows that Mormon Trail. That was the dominant one, and then it splits off there at Fort Bridgeton, close to Salt Lake City. One goes north, and then one goes south. Actually, it's at Fort Hale. In Idaho. It seems crazy that you have to go that far north then to go south, but you did that because of the terrain, right? Other people tried to blaze new trails. You can see the Santa Fe Trail. People are going to Santa Fe. And then there's the Spanish Trail, and a lot of people are going to Southern California, which not many people went at that time. I want you to look at these pictures. The one on the right is a wagon train, groups of people with their Conestoga wagons that would go out there. And the limestone, you can see to the left at one of these trails, was worn down so much that the trail is marked by how it was grooved out from people and horses and wagons, just thousands and thousands of people going through there and breaking the rock down. Okay, and then there's, of course, the doomed Donner Party. Now, the Donner Party set off, and I'll talk about this in a minute, the next slide, but you can see they left from actually Springfield. They go to Independence, Missouri, and they're trying a different route. The lead guy that they had used, they said, we'll go this direction, so they tried that, but they get bogged down probably 2 or 3 weeks behind. They just about made it. They get up into the Sierra Nevada mountains, right? And then they get this horrible blizzard, as luck would have it. So they're stuck up there with no food. And let me just turn the slide. So about 89 of them go, right? They leave Springfield, Missouri in the early spring of 1846. There were some wealthy people who did it, Jacob and George Donner, and they decide to take that new route, but they get trapped up there in October. October is an early time for snowfall, right? Eventually, some of them, only 45 of them, make it out. Now, a lot of them died from starvation while they were up there, and others were forced to eat them. So they did resort to cannibalism. It was either that or die themselves. They really had no alternative because there was no food available. To the right are images of some of those people who survived that, and they told their story. It was kind of in the newspapers at the time. All right, so again, if we look at it, 1840 to 1860, there were 250,000 people who made that trek, most of them because of gold. All right, so here's a Bierstadt painting of the Oregon Trail. And now let's talk about mining. I think that this is the last thing we're going to talk about. We'll see. But if you look at the map on the left, those areas in gold are locations where gold has been discovered. The mineral-rich mountains of the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevadas. Besides that, there's also silver bonanzas, gold in various territories. And you could see on there when the dates of these gold strikes would be found, right? So the one that we're concerned about, you can see Sutter's Creek to the left. That's in California, and it's up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it's just to the east of San Francisco. So a lot of people started to go out there once gold was discovered in California in 1848. There's going to be other finds of gold too. But notice in California, the population in 1848 was only 14,000. By 1860, it was 380,000. This brought people from all over, especially even from China. And by 1860, 1/3 of all the Western miners, not of all the people, but of the miners, were Chinese people. So originally, only men went out there, and then women would follow, right? And then pretty soon, more and more families were coming out there, and then the population would grow. But it's not a state. Gold was discovered in 1848, and for those first year or two, it was very lawless. It was like Badlands, you know, it's just terrible things were happening there. And people are like, we need some law and order there. And so California wanted to become a state. But then the issue was going to be like, well, are you going to be slave or are you going to be free? So it's going to be a problem. Okay, so the gold was found on this man's mine there, and it was a mill is what he had. So probably it might have been like a paper mill. It would have been, you know, a lumber mill or something like that. And they discovered gold, right? There were flakes that were discovered there. The owner was John Sutton, and as I said, in the next 7 years, there's going to be about 30,000 people that go there. And because of the lawlessness, California wants statehood, and so they draft a resolution or a constitution, and it banned slavery. So this is going to upset the South. All right, so here's an image of some gold miners, and the map here shows where all the locations that gold was discovered in the mountains of the Sierra Nevadas in California. And then here's San Francisco to the left, as it would have appeared back in the 1850s. This was a location where you could get supplies because of the good harbor that was right there. Ships would sail into San Francisco and a lot of supplies would get there. It was much easier than going overland from the east coast of the United States. You'd have to go all the way, though, around the tip of South America to get there. But because of its location, this became a center for population, commercial, naval, and financial growth right there. Okay, we also get some farmers that go out there, people wanting just a piece of land and a homestead where they can raise their families. And so government passed what's known as these preemptive acts, and I think this is a way of trying to get people there before other people would come in and take it. You want to prevent other countries from taking the land. So they could go in there, and when the government put it up for sale, then they could buy it pretty cheap. So that was the plan. But it was expensive to go. If you were going to go, you had to have $200 to $300 for your wagon, all your supplies, everything that you're going to need to get there, and that would have been about $6,000 to $7,000. And then you have no source of income once you do get there, so you really needed money. Life was very difficult, and as a result, people develop and when they get there, they develop these institutions to make it easier for them to live and function at the other end, right? So, and they replicate things that they were familiar with in the eastern part of the United States or in Europe. All right, and then we start to see the emergence of cities. San Francisco, as I said, and Denver, those are both mining towns. But then as people had to stop along the way, we get Salt Lake City and Santa Fe because that's where they would resupply, right? A lot of these cities grew along those links where there was transportation. Eventually, it's going to attract people who want to start businesses or banks or tradesmen or other people. So more and more people are migrating out there. All right, and then we get the expanding economy in the West as well. Right, you need the industry and the technology to go out there. All these different consumer goods were being produced in the East, and they were being shipped out to the West. We're also getting the development of technology too on the East, and we talked about this in previous chapter with new technology like the sewing machine and the telegraph. Right? But railroads is going to be very important for the development of the West and expanding from the East Coast to the West Coast. They start to be built after the canal movement, and this is going to be in the 1840s and 1850s. And this encourages trade with one side of the country and the middle part of the country and then the East Coast. And so it also, the railroads stimulates the growth of all sorts of other industries because you need so much much to create a railroad, right? You need steel, you need the cars, you need fabric, you need coal stops along the way, you need all sorts of different things, right? Eventually, what's going to happen is the federal government and the states are going to subsidize it. And if you look at like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the fourth sub bullet under railroads emerge, Illinois helped to fund the Illinois Central Railroad, and that went to, actually the government did, the federal government did, from Lake Michigan all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This is one of the first that went north-south. Most all of them went east-west, right? So eventually this is, as they build more and more, it's going to be a very cheap way of transporting people, goods, resources. The thing is, it's going to be much more developed in the North at the time of the Civil War than it is in the South. Okay, here is the Illinois Central. I Googled this, and this is one of the first pictures that came up, and this is Monticello, Illinois. And if you look very closely on the map, you could kind of see where Monticello is. We're going to see later, too, there's the Wabash Railroad, and as you know, that went through here as well. Okay, another thing that we start to do, there's increased trade and immigration from foreign countries, and that's because now through the development of technology and the steam power, we're going to get steam ships. So shipping becomes more efficient and more predictable. They start to set schedules on when it's going to sail and that sort of thing. And so people start to trade with other countries, and one thing they're looking for, of course, from the United States, besides cotton, now in the east or the northeast, is whale oil. It becomes a commodity out of New England. And so they're shipping that. They develop new ship designs with bigger cargo holds, and you got these great, steam ships that are trading to all parts of the world, including Asia. Right, and so we increase our relationship with Asia. What happens is we go and we negotiate the Treaty of Shanghai. The book didn't talk about this. Caleb Cushing, the Attorney General under Franklin Pierce, he negotiated this, and basically what it did is it established trade with China, and all European countries are seeking to trade with China as well. And then we get the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. Commodore Matthew Perry went there with these big, powerful ships, and American ships, steamships. And the Japanese weren't so sure about that. They weren't as technologically advanced. And Perry said, we want to trade with you. I'll give you a year to consider it. And he comes back a year later, and they opened up trade. Initially, it was just a coaling station where Americans could go and get coal to refuel because it was powered on steam engine, and the coal was used to heat the engine so that you could get steam to power the engine. So you needed to have coaling stations around the world where you can go and refuel, otherwise you're just trapped. Right? But then a lot of this westward expansion ends with the Panic of 1857. So the reason why this panic or depression happened was there was overproduction of crops in the Midwest, right? When too many farmers were producing the same cash crop, then the prices fall. So when the farmers cannot produce anymore, they can't sell their crops, and they forfeit on their loans. They're not buying products from the East Coast, and so if they're not providing enough products, or they're not buying enough, then they stop production of products in the East. And so manufacturing plants shut down, and that leads to unemployment in the cities. And this is really bad for cities because now people are dependent upon a paycheck. You can't just go and grow crops or forage in the forest. So they're in the cities and they're homeless, right? They're unemployment. Also, though, in the South, the cotton, though, the price remained high because there was still a demand for that in England and Europe, other parts of the world. And so the Southerners, this leads them to believe that their system is far more superior, and it gets some thinking that we can just secede. Okay, see you in chapter 13. Thanks for listening.